Where do food systems begin, and where do they end? What do they embed, and what other systems are embedded in food? Is there anything outside of the systems of food, given how humans and the planet are also mixed and mingled and muddled? And when should we talk about the food system, singular, versus all systems, in plural? So many systems, so little podcast time. Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that systematically systemizes systems towards systematic systemization. Oh, never mind. It's a show about food and studying it. Yeah, that's it. I'm David Santo, and I have clearly lost my contact with reality, but here we go one more time with pluralism, thinking and doing and feeling, and some truly great guests. This episode considers the food of carceral systems, both within and outside of prisons, as well as within and outside of incarcerated people. It's also about justice and identity, and the ways in which taste and edibility can be used for both good and evil. Our guests come at these questions from wonderfully diverse angles and leave us with a lot of space to explore, and, of course, questions to ask. As the final episode of Season 1 of Digesting Food Studies, this seems like a kind of useful note to take a pause on. Always leave your audience wanting more, right? Well, maybe. The focus today is the themed section of Canadian Food Studies called Exploring Carceral Food Systems, Tensions, Experiences, and Possibilities, which appeared in Volume 12, Number 1, that was published in May of 2025. And for the final opening mouthful this season, Alexia Moyer kicks things off with an Amuse Bouche that draws on a painful yet informative piece of food history. She looks at the Prisoners of War cookbook, which was printed in 1946 and recounts some of the experiences of Western prisoners of war in Changi Jail in Singapore during World War II. Like many accounts of food during wartime, it represents both horror and hope. During the Chewing on Research segment, Carceral Food Systems guest editor Amanda Wilson talks about the systems of carcerality and of food, including their overlaps and their disconnects. She also offers some very useful prompts for thinking about food and prisons beyond food systems and food studies, challenging us to think and act more broadly than we sometimes do. And then, in the aftertaste, the oh-so-polyvalent activist, student cook, and social gastronomer, Joshna Maharaj, responds to Kelsey Timler's piece in CFS that examines individualized pizzas as a form of protest and resistance. All right, Alexia, episode 20, last one of the season. I'm excited to talk to you about this subject. It's actually coming from one of our more recent issues on carceral food systems, a serious but fascinating subject. So what have you got for us today?
For old time's sake, I brought you another cookbook.
A cookbook? Well, the ways that you unpack them, they always come out much more than just cookbooks.
This is why I picked this cookbook, because it tells us about imagination. And this is sort of the central thrust of the Amuse Bouche today. The thing that we learned through this food and carceral systems themed section is that incarcerated individuals, in order to eat well, understanding that there are various understandings of what eating well means, they have to be creative, and they have to be clever, and they have to learn to barter, and they have to be inventive, but they also, and this is something that was touched on less, have to have a really good imagination. So I chose this cookbook. I came to it via Suzanne Evans, who wrote about it in the journal Canadian Military History, as well as in the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. And it's the proceedings centered on imagination in 2021, in case you're looking for it, as well as the novelized biography called The Taste of Longing that is based on the life of the book's editor. So the cookbook in question is called The Prisoners of War Cookbook, and the subtitle is, "This is a collection of recipes made by starving prisoners of war when they were interned in Changi Jail, Singapore." And it was printed in 1946.
Wow, that's a subtitle and a half.
Yes. The editor or compiler is Ethel Mulvaney, who was a prisoner there from 1942 to 1945, and she's originally from Manitoulin Island. And she had traveled extensively as organizing director of the Canadian Society for Literature and the Arts. And she ended up in Singapore when her husband, a British Army doctor, was posted there. Now, wartime cookbooks are different from prisoner of war cookbooks.
Yeah, I imagine.
The central impulse of a wartime cookbook is to help cooks make more with less. So how do you make a cake when you don't have butter or eggs or milk? Or how do you make a meatloaf without meat? Mm-hmm. A prisoner of war cookbook is quite the opposite. It is evocative of remembered and or desired meals. It contains recipes with everything in it and more. Lots of emphasis on sweet things, more sugar than vegetables. Suzanne Evans describes it as a, quote, collection of such rich confections and meaty main course dishes that you might think that prisoners were teasing each other with descriptions of the unattainable.
So in some ways, these are recipes of memory more than recipes of actual making?
Yes. Yes. And actually, it was difficult for them sometimes to get the right measurements. Mm-hmm. And there are some really creative ways in which these measurements are being described. Now, let's first try and understand the conditions of this prison as described by Suzanne Evans. After the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942, civilians, mainly British, Australian, American, Dutch, were interned in Changi Jail. So this was a high-security British prison, newly built in 1936, and the men were segregated from the women and children. The compound was made up of 11 acres of buildings and exercise yards.
Wow.
It was built for 600, and it housed 3,500 people during this time.
Holy cow.
So it was really, really overcrowded. Ethel Mulvaney shared her one-person cell with 2 others. So you can try and imagine how sleeping arrangements happened on one sort of sleeping platform. Food rations at Changi Jail, insufficient to begin with, were reduced throughout the war in quantity and quality. But the women would often get together in groups to talk about food. Now, they weren't making the food. This task took place on the men's side of the jail because of the physically demanding tasks required of chopping wood for fuel and hauling sacks of rice. And Mulvaney called these sitting circles tea parties.
The circles of the women talking about food.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And they would sit in a circle on the floor, on the ground, and then they would set the table with words, from the chairs that they would be actually sitting on to the flower arrangements to the cutlery that they would use. It was very elaborate and detailed. And then they would share recipes, which they would write onto strips of newspaper, which is sort of found in an abandoned corner of the jail. And these would be transcribed into a ledger. So just getting paper in a system that forbade diary keeping was a challenge in and of itself. Not to mention remembering the recipes and, as I said, providing clear directions and measurements. And this was an activity that took place regularly. This exercise in culinary imagination was, and this is the crux of Evans' argument, a survival tool. It gave women something to do in a situation where there wasn't much to do, and it gave them purpose. And talking about food helped to soften the edge of hunger. Mulvaney helped make this collection when she weighed 85 pounds. Now, the interesting thing about this book is that it's not one of a kind. These fantasy meals have been recorded across the globe by people whose everyday life is circumscribed to the nth degree, and they hunger for many things, some of which is edible. And the recipes within this book remind us that when we are lacking the thing itself, imagining the thing can do our bodies and our minds a world of good.
Yeah. Well, and remembering our food ways is a way of coming back to ourselves before we were the thing that we are when we're incarcerated or when we are imprisoned or when we are no longer what we were before. People with refugee experience often come back to their identities before being, in quotes, refugees. They were just themselves, and they do that through food. But this also reminds me of In Memory's Kitchen, the collection of recipes from the women of Theresienstadt, and how by recalling recipes and sometimes even making them with limited ingredients, you re-become who you were before you were denied your freedom.
Yes. Yeah, there's a looking backward, and then there's a looking forward towards a time where this might not be the reality.
Well, much to think about and chew on, dare I say. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Amanda Wilson is an associate professor in the School of Social Innovation at St. Paul University in Ottawa. A longtime community organizer and activist in that same city, Amanda brings perspectives from network coordination and popular education into conversation with our academic research. That research looks at food movements and alternative food networks, as well as carceral food systems and what she calls a politics of possibility. Along with Amy Stearns, Amanda guest edited the theme section of CFS on which this episode is focused. So, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us here on Digesting Food Studies. I'm really interested and intrigued to be talking to you about carceral food systems, this area of food studies that I hadn't heard about until we published a special themed section on it in the journal. But could you tell us a little bit about what makes carceral food systems and the underlying theory behind this area of study so interesting, important, and perhaps maybe a little mysterious or invisible at any rate to most of our reading audience?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for having me. I think, to me, at its core, carceral food systems is about understanding both, kind of the food pathways, the food ways of prisons, but also just about understanding how food systems and carceral systems are interconnected and how they both, sort of shape and influence one another. And so, to me, what's really interesting about that is food, and this isn't unique to this, but, food has this interesting kind of dynamic quality where in this context, it helps us understand and sort of appreciate these horrific harms that are happening in prisons and carceral institutions, but then also helps us understand how incarcerated folks and their allies are resisting those harms, and then also helps us to kind of imagine how we might move beyond those harms and kind of transform those institutions so there aren't those harms happening. To me, that's always important in an area of work that, yes, we're understanding these incredible inequalities and oppressions that are happening, but also there's a space to kind of imagine and move beyond and resist. To me, that's one of the reasons why I think carceral food systems is a really interesting place to work. It helps us think about, colonialism and how both prisons and agriculture were sort of used as tools of having ownership over territory, right? But it can also help us think about how people can heal from the harms of prisons and reimagine other ways of responding to harm.
We know that many large institutions that feed people can often have pretty terrible food, hospitals, schools, prisons. We have come to understand that institutionalized food is very often problematic. But then it becomes, I think for the non-expert audience, it's an interesting question because for many of us who don't have much experience with people who have been incarcerated or with prison life in general, there's an understanding that prisons are supposed to be places of punishment. Except when you get to punishing people with food, it's a whole other set of inequality and inequity and unfairness. And so there's a tension there that I think must be hard for people who haven't spent time thinking about this to understand. So can you sort of unpack the ways that food is used as excessive punishment or control mechanisms within the carceral system that can help people understand how that's not okay?
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe the first thing I'll say is I think we often think that the goal of prisons is punishment, but actually in theory, the way our system is supposed to be set up is that it's just the removal from society that is the punishment, right? That the sort of being sequestered, being removed, that is supposed to be the punishment, that the actual experience of incarceration isn't supposed to be a form of punishment. Clearly, we know from many incarcerated people that it is, in fact, quite punitive.
Yeah, and punishment is not the goal. I mean, in fact, we often call it corrections, the system of coming back into society, but generally speaking, the systems of prisons, social or food or otherwise, don't actually help people reintegrate very much. It, in fact, exacerbates the problems that they've been experiencing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sites of incredible harm. Yeah, if we look at how food is a tool of punishment, you hear all the time just the quality and the quantity of food served is disgusting, to just put it plainly. It's certainly not healthy. It's not nutritious, but also just the sort of ways in which people's relationships to food are severed. And I think food helps us sort of humanize the experience of incarcerated people because, we all have very intimate relationships with food. And so the idea of not having any control over what we're eating, or it being very hard to access foods that are important to us, or having foods taken away or being forced to eat particular foods, I think that there's a real humanizing element to that we can all relate to.
So in many ways, I mean, this aligns with the discourse around food security and food sovereignty, that having culturally appropriate access to food on a regular basis that nourishes our bodies is a human right and should be a human right for everybody, whether or not you have been incarcerated. It's just a fundamental way of being human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the themed section of Canadian Food Studies that you co-edited, what were some of the specific stories or themes or subjects that the authors have raised up for those audience members who have not yet read our wonderful theme section on carceral food systems?
Not yet.
But will.
Yeah, well, and I think the collection of articles in the section really highlights the diversity of carceral food systems as a space of research and work, because I think, some of them are looking at people's experience of food while they were incarcerated, right? And speaking to how awful the food was, or even experiences of working in food services and feeling a lot of complicated feelings about that, knowing that you're serving your fellow incarcerated people quite awful food, using food as a tool of community and solidarity, often in opposition to the official policies. So I think there's lots of interesting stuff around just the experience of food in prisons. But then, Kelsey Timler's article is really neat in terms of using food after incarceration as a tool of community and healing, talking about making pizzas together
right.
With a group of women who had experiences of incarceration, or even Elsa's article looking at the experiences of food for families who are visiting loved ones in prison. All these facets that we often don't think about or are sort of made to be invisible within carceral institutions. I think a lot of the articles shed light on those different facets.
Yeah, fascinating. So although there are not a ton of articles in this special theme section, there is a great deal of diversity. And it's not just about the institutional food, but the whole food systems, all of the food systems that are embedded within and that embed carceral systems more broadly.
Exactly.
So it's getting, surprise, it's getting to that big systems of systems perspective that we're always trying to deal with in food studies. But one of the things that I was particularly interested in is how food can be, as you mentioned, a tool of coming back to oneself. The idea that people who've gone through some sort of trauma of displacement or trauma of separation, whether it's being an immigrant or a refugee or a displaced person or an incarcerated person, that food can also bring you back from that experience and help reintegrate you into your pre-existing society or into a new society that you have found as a result of having gone through that traumatic experience. So, because it feels like there's a lot of space for that in future food work that's adjacent to food studies. Does that feel like it's a hidden space of the carceral food systems world, or is it becoming more and more evident? Because I know that there's also many things like shame and ostracization that comes from having been an incarcerated person.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of fabulous work that happens that we just don't see and we just don't know about, right? I think in part because of that shame and because a lot of real barriers that exist to folks when they get out, right? When they're back on the outside and trying to rebuild community and reconnect and kind of rebuild their lives because of that separation. And yeah, I think food certainly has a role to play in that, in allowing people to reconnect to oneself, to their family, to their communities. And also, I think within carceral food studies, there's always this tension between, food can help alleviate harm or can help rebuild after suffering. And we want to make sure that we're not just responding to those harms, but actually thinking of how can we dismantle those structures so that those harms don't exist in the first place. There's a lot of work around horticultural therapy in prisons, right? And gardens in prisons, and sort of how those can be sort of a small place of calm or hope or community. And yes, and we don't want to lose sight of, say for someone like me who fundamentally believes we should abolish carceral systems, that we're still having that sort of structural lens of, yes, food can build community and build healing, but ultimately we shouldn't have to be doing that if we can dismantle those institutions of harm in the first place.
Right. Well, you just mentioned that this is a subject that is close to your active life, your personal life, your intellectual life, I imagine. And so if you've been interested in the dismantlement of carceral systems for a while, is this food and carcerality a new theme for you, or has it just been a convergence of themes that you've been working on for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, sort of by accident or sort of happenstance. I love food studies and I love that world. And sometimes I get frustrated that we're a bit insular, that we often look to problems in our food system and try to solve it through the food system. And I think that sometimes the real harms or problems in our food system require us to look outside of just the food system to address them. So this is maybe, I guess, 6 years ago now, I was sort of grappling with that frustration. And, not that I did a lot of work on sort of prisoner justice abolition work, but, it was sort of a value and politic that I held and, had done some support work in that area. And I knew about the prison farms and sort of the movements around that. And I remember just kind of Googling around and trying to work through in my head connections between prisons and food and how to think about that. And I just stumbled upon a call for proposals for a conference. I think it was the American Association of Geographers. It was on carceral food systems. Yeah. And that was the first time I had heard it put that way. And then that sort of led me down many, many rabbit holes. And to me, it's a really interesting space, to connect those two issues. And how does food help us think about prisons differently? And how does looking at prisons help us think about food differently?
Fabulous. Well, and I guess unsurprisingly, in this gorgeous world of thinkers and doers that we have around us, some people have actually been thinking about these semi-invisible, not invisible intersections between food and other systems. So I'm so glad that you found that call for papers and that we at CFS and our readers have got to benefit from it. So what's next? Like, what other themes are you thinking about or potentially exploring, or would you have been interested to publish more on in this theme section, like within the larger subject of carceral food?
I mean, so many things. One thing I've been looking at recently is around the canteens in prisons. Mm-hmm. So, so all prisons have canteens, and as the sort of institutional food has deteriorated, particularly in federal prisons kind of over the past 10, 15 years. And I think provincially it's been pretty awful for a while. More and more incarcerated people rely on the canteen for their basic sustenance, right? So they're buying their meals there. They're relying on that for food. And of course, the food that's in or available in canteens is highly processed, pretty unhealthy, and also very expensive. So I've been doing some access to information requests to kind of get those canteen lists and those prices to kind of map out this area where I think increasingly it's people's basic sustenance for food while incarcerated, kind of understanding what those offerings are and what does that mean in terms of the food that is on offer.
Well, we will look forward to another article or another theme section or other conferences or calls for papers about the subject. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think this will give a lot of points of entry into this particular section in this particular issue of CFS. So thank you so much for shining the light where it wasn't necessarily so bright.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Joshna Maharaj is a multifaceted chef, writer, and activist who is currently conducting her doctoral studies at Technological University Dublin in Dublin, Ireland. She is the author of the book Take Back the Tray, Revolutionizing Food in Hospitals, Schools, and Other Institutions, and is a 2-time TEDx speaker. The article she responds to in this segment is Kelsey Timler's Protest Pizzas, Resisting Carcerality with Storytelling, Community Building, and an Array of Toppings.
Hello, this is Joshna Maharaj. I am an MA student at TU Dublin in Ireland and will soon excitedly be a PhD student right at TU Dublin as well. The main themes and topics of my research are really focused on how we learn about food and food ways. My master's research has been about investigating the effect of such strong French influence in culinary education in Canada. And the PhD work will actually take a look at Indigenous traditions of sharing knowledge about food and food ways. So with this as my foundation, I really was quite excited to read this piece. The article really reminded me of my time working at the Stop in Toronto. We would host a weekly pizza oven session for the community with much of the same intentions and values as the one in the article, though not specifically with incarcerated women. And it was one of the things that really struck me was the mention about how even on the smallest scale, the idea that someone would have the power and freedom to make choices about what ingredients they wanted to put on a pizza that they were going to eat is perhaps a much more powerful thing than we may initially recognize. I also love the idea of protest recipes. The activist inside of me is delighted by this, and the line in the article that says that protest recipes are foods that refuse to be subjugated or silenced, foods that connect to histories before colonial violence and carceral scarcity. With my research, I'm on the hunt for recipes and food stories that are outside of the context of the canon, because I really believe that professional cooking needs to have a deeper connection to a wider diversity of recipes and stories, particularly in a world like the one we're in, grappling with issues like equity, diversity, decolonization, and the displacement people. Plus, I just love the idea of there being resistance on a plate or in an oven. This way, I really believe that every plate of food tells the story of how it came to be and the values that have produced it. When I think I consider the idea of a new perspective on my research material from this piece, something that really struck me was the reminder about how food is a way to connect to humanity. So often we talk about food as a marker of identity, especially in the context of culture. But when you're a prisoner, or if you've spent time in prison, your identity is tagged with this experience, and it can be so difficult to shake it, even long after you've served your time and gotten on with your life outside of prison. So the big lesson that I take away from this is that beautiful reminder that working with food allows you to be human. And in many cases, it allows you to return to your humanity, perhaps from a context where you're riddled with many identity labels that the world has sort of forced upon you. The thing is, the bottom line that I love so much is that in the kitchen, at a stove, or around a table, we are all just humans having a simple human experience. As Timler says on page 6, cooking enables prisoners to have a moment of separation from their identities as criminals. Even just saying that sentence makes me feel the lightness of what we're talking about here. Now, for other people who are reading this piece and who are perhaps not in this particular area of focus with their work, I really think that there are applications of this philosophy or this idea that will work in other contexts. And one of the most compelling bits of wisdom that I've pulled is the thought and care that needs to go into building programs like this pizza session. It may seem to be really simple to make some dough and gather the ingredients to make pizzas, but the author of this piece really took the time to explain her process. And I love how on page 7 she talks about using a methodology of flexibility and accepting that people's engagement will ebb and flow. This, like, the truth of this is real, like I feel it on the inside, right? You can build the best program that you can with all of the resources, but if you haven't thought through how to engage your hopeful participants, you won't be successful. And you need to work to the timeline of the group and your expectations for how people will join, how long they will stay. All of those things need to be kind of put to the side, and you need to offer sort of surrender to the process and to the group. Timler also made this lovely note about how these programs have to move at the speed of trust, a pace so slow that sometimes you go hours without talking about research at all. And this is what I love about this is, yes, the kitchen helps because you can be peeling potatoes with somebody in silence, but maybe you could be doing any number of things. Maybe you could be washing cars or fixing things or planting things with that same kind of safety and comfort in the dynamic of the sort of the program or the engagement. This really resonates with my experience doing community food security work and with my work in public institutions, right? Regardless of where you are, when working with vulnerable people, things need to slow down and they need to open up. I was delighted to read this piece. I will take it with me in my future work and research, and I've been delighted to be able to participate with you this way. Thank you.
So that wraps things up for Season 1 of Digesting Food Studies. We will be back again, however, thanks to your enthusiasm for the show and, of course, the very necessary funding that allows us to keep producing new episodes. We've covered a lot of ground this season, from fisheries to meat production and feminist studies to indigenous sovereignty. We've considered the materiality of food waste, and of pesticides. We've looked at food in schools and prisons, as well as in bento boxes and in social isolation. We've made connections between first food systems, those of newborns that is, and epistemic systems, from cultural reproduction to historical analysis. And we have, unsurprisingly, shown how food and humans construct each other, often for the better, though sometimes for the worse, and how power and language and identity thread their way through each other. In other words, we did what food studies does. We talked and acted about it, we celebrated its complexities, and we kept asking questions. I hope you too are asking more questions, and we'll keep exploring the systems of food. and, of course, of other stuff.
Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.
My thanks to Alexia Moyer, Amanda Wilson, and Joshna Maharaj, whose ideas on carceral food are both tightly wrought and helpfully liberating. Once again, my special thanks to Zélie Scherer for her audio consultation services over these last episodes. Our executive producers are the systematically wonderful Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett. And I'm David Santo. While you're waiting for Season 2 of the show to come around, no doubt with bated breath and incredible impatience, I can only suggest that you go back and catch up on some of our past episodes. There are 20 of them. That means there's something for every food studies lover, and when you find that theme that rings your bell, I'd ask you to ring ours, with a review or rating, that is. Summer is a great time for new podcasts, but it's also a time for helping new listeners discover this one. Have I already said a few times how food is everything? I know that a series of podcasts, even 20 of them, can hardly be considered everything. But in the intersections of these episodes, I think there are plenty of universes to be found. After my undergrad degree in chemical physics, I decided I never wanted to be an academic, because I just didn't want to specialize and focus and limit my explorations to a tightly framed space. But in studying food in my later years, I learned how deep and wide one can go when the subject is approached with more generalism. That's the glory of food studies, I think. Not just its plurality and complexity, but that it's kind of a multi-dimensional space, an area studies to wander around in. A multiverse made of materiality, of meaningful messages, and much magnificent movement. Some alliteration, too. So thank you for being part of this marvelous mess. Digesting Food Studies, Season 1, out.